When the first German prisoners of war stepped off transport trains onto American soil in 1943, they carried more than just military equipment. They brought with them 12 years of Nazi propaganda. Propaganda that had taught them women existed to serve, never to lead. What happened next quietly dismantled one of the Third Reich's most fundamental lies. This is the story of how American women shattered Nazi ideology without firing a single shot. Before continuing, consider giving this video a like and subscribe. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States held over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war in more than 700 camps scattered across 46 states. Most were German soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. The sheer scale of this operation created an enormous administrative challenge. The military needed translators, educators, medical staff, labor coordinators, and camp administrators. By 1944, millions of American women had already entered the workforce to replace men serving overseas. This transformation extended into the POW camp system itself. Women worked as Red Cross representatives, civilian employees of the War Department, educational directors, translators, nurses, and administrative supervisors. In some camps, women held direct authority over prisoner schedules, work assignments, educational programs, and disciplinary procedures. For German POWs raised under National Socialism, this reality contradicted everything they had been taught. To understand what these men believed, we must briefly examine Nazi gender ideology. From 1933 onward, the Third Reich promoted a rigid view of women's roles. The regime glorified motherhood and domesticity while systematically excluding women from higher education, professional careers, and political life. The Nazi slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, summarized the boundaries of acceptable female existence. Nazi propaganda portrayed working women as unnatural, especially women in positions of authority. Joseph Goebbels and other regime leaders repeatedly claimed that female leadership violated natural law and weakened societies. Young German men were educated in Hitler Youth programs that reinforced these beliefs from childhood. When these soldiers arrived in American POW camps, many genuinely believed women in authority positions represented either moral corruption or theatrical pretense. Some expected American women to be weak, easily intimidated, or merely symbolic figures without real power. Reality delivered a different lesson. Camp records and post-war interviews reveal a pattern of initial resistance. At camps like Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri and Camp Ellis in Illinois, some German POWs openly mocked female staff members during their first weeks of internment. They laughed at women giving instructions, refused to acknowledge female translators, and made dismissive comments in German, assuming they would not be understood. These behaviors ended quickly. American women in the camp system did not plead for respect or seek approval. When POWs violated camp regulations or showed insubordination, consequences followed through established military procedures. Privileges were revoked. Recreational time was reduced. Serious infractions resulted in isolation or transfer to higher security facilities. The authority behind these decisions was real, documented, and enforced. What is rarely discussed is how systematically these women were prepared for their roles. The War Department provided training programs specifically for civilians working with POWs. Women learned military protocol, prisoner psychology, and conflict de-escalation techniques. They understood both the Geneva Conventions and U.S. military law. When they spoke with institutional backing. German prisoners accustomed to symbolic female roles found themselves answering to women who controlled tangible aspects of their daily existence. Perhaps the most direct challenge to Nazi ideology came through the camp education programs. Beginning in 1944, The War Department launched a systematic re-education initiative designed to introduce democratic principles to German POWs. The goal was not forced conversion, but exposure, providing access to ideas the Nazi regime had suppressed. Women played central roles as educators and program administrators. They taught English classes, facilitated discussion groups, and supervised access to American newspapers, books, and films. These sessions covered subjects Nazi Germany had forbidden: democratic governance, free speech, religious pluralism, and gender equality. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, records show that a female education director named Dorothy Thompson organized weekly seminars on American constitutional principles. POWs attended voluntarily, but found themselves in direct conversations with a woman who openly discussed women's suffrage, property rights, and professional opportunities. Topics that directly contradicted everything they had learned. What made these encounters particularly significant was their calm, academic tone. American women did not argue emotionally or defensively. They presented facts, cited historical documents, and answered questions with the confidence of people discussing established reality rather than controversial opinions. Historians later discovered that many German POWs found these sessions more unsettling than physical confinement. Ideas presented as natural and obvious by educated American women could not easily be dismissed as enemy propaganda. Beyond education, American women supervised POW labor details across the country. With agricultural and industrial labor shortages reaching crisis levels, POW work programs became essential to the American economy. German prisoners picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, processed food in California, and worked in lumber mills across the Pacific Northwest. Female civilian supervisors frequently managed these operations. At agricultural sites in Nebraska and Kansas, women coordinated work schedules, transportation, supply distribution, and quality control. They assigned tasks, monitored productivity, and reported violations. When disputes arose, they resolved them through established channels, not by deferring to male colleagues, but by exercising the authority their positions carried. Camp records from Fort Robinson in Nebraska detail one incident where German POWs refused orders from a female agricultural supervisor, assuming she lacked enforcement power. Within hours, the entire work detail lost recreational privileges for 2 weeks. The decision came from the camp commandant, but the initial report and recommendation came directly from the female supervisor. The POWs learned quickly that her authority was not decorative. This decision quietly changed the course of how many POWs understood power structures. Authority in America did not flow exclusively through male hierarchies. Women held positions because they were competent, and their competence was backed by institutional systems that treated their judgment seriously. American women also served as nurses, social workers, and Red Cross representatives within the POW camp system. These roles brought them into close, sustained contact with prisoners under circumstances that revealed character and capability. German POWs received medical care that often exceeded what they had experienced in Wehrmacht field hospitals. American nurses treated injuries, managed infectious disease outbreaks, and provided surgical assistance. They worked professionally, efficiently, and without the deference many POWs expected from women in caregiving roles. One post-war account from a former POW held at Camp Rustin in Louisiana described his surprise at being treated by an American surgical nurse who managed an emergency appendectomy with calm precision. He had expected incompetence or hesitation. Instead, he found professionalism that saved his life. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Red Cross workers provided another point of contact. They distributed mail, organized recreational activities, and investigated camp conditions. When POWs filed complaints or requests, they often addressed them to female Red Cross representatives who documented concerns and forwarded them through official channels. These women did not simply listen sympathetically. They investigated, reported, and ensured accountability. For men taught that women lacked rational judgment. Encountering women who processed complex information, made binding decisions, and commanded institutional respect challenged foundational assumptions. Change did not happen instantly. Most German POWs did not experience sudden conversions or dramatic revelations. Instead, exposure to American women in authority accumulated over months and years of internment. Daily interactions created patterns. A female translator who corrected a prisoner's English without hesitation, a civilian administrator who denied a request and explained why through clear, logical reasoning, a teacher who answered ideological challenges with historical evidence rather than emotional appeals, a nurse who provided competent care without seeking approval or validation. These experiences were ordinary, repetitive, and undramatic, which made them impossible to dismiss as exceptions or anomalies. By 1945, camp reports noted declining incidents of insubordination toward female staff. POWs who had openly mocked women in 1943 now followed instructions without comment. Respect came not from punishment, but from accumulated evidence that American women were simply doing their jobs competently. Before we continue, if you're interested in more untold stories from World War II, please consider subscribing. This channel focuses on lesser-known history that shaped our modern world. After the war, many former POWs returned to Germany carrying memories that conflicted with the society they were rejoining. West Germany remained deeply conservative regarding gender roles throughout the 1950s. Women who had worked during wartime were expected to return to domestic life. Professional opportunities remained limited. Political leadership was overwhelmingly male. Yet some former POWs later admitted in interviews and memoirs that their time in American camps had permanently altered their thinking. They described encountering American women not as a political statement, but as a practical reality that worked. These men had seen women exercise authority effectively, make sound decisions under pressure, and command respect through competence rather than aggression. One former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed in the 1980s, reflected that his internment in Texas had been more ideologically challenging than battlefield defeat. Military loss could be attributed to resources, strategy, or luck, but watching American women function competently in roles Nazi ideology claimed women could never fill required either dismissing observable reality or reconsidering fundamental beliefs. Not all POWs reached the same conclusions. Some returned to Germany unchanged, dismissing their American experience as an aberration or cultural peculiarity. But enough were affected that historians have documented a measurable shift in attitudes among Germans who spent significant time in American POW camps compared to those who did not. This story exists within a larger transformation happening across America during World War II. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of American women in the workforce increased from 12 million to over 18 million. Women worked in aircraft factories, shipyards, steel mills, and munitions plants. They served as engineers, scientists, mathematicians, and pilots. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon representing a fundamental shift in what American society considered possible. The POW camp system reflected this broader reality. Women did not enter these roles as symbolic gestures or temporary experiments. They filled positions because the wartime economy demanded their labor and because they proved capable of handling responsibilities previously reserved for men. German POWs were not observing a propaganda campaign. They were witnessing the ordinary functioning of a society that had already made different choices about gender and opportunity. This distinction matters. Nazi propaganda portrayed gender equality as ideological fantasy, incompatible with stable civilization. American women demonstrated daily that competent female leadership was not theoretical. It was operational, functional, and integrated into the institutions managing the war effort itself. The experience of German POWs in American camps contributed to post-war intellectual shifts in Western Europe. While attributing direct causation is difficult, historians note that Germany's post-war democratization included gradual expansion of women's rights, voting rights guaranteed in the Basic Law of 1949, increased educational access in the 1950s and 1960s, and progressive legal reforms throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Former POWs were not the primary drivers of these changes, but they were part of a generation exposed to alternative models of social organization. When debates arose about women's roles in reconstructed German society, some voices in those conversations had personal experience witnessing functional alternatives. More broadly, the POW camp experience illustrates how ideological beliefs confront practical reality. Nazi gender ideology was not abstract philosophy. It made specific claims about what women could and could not do. American women in the POW camp system did not argue against those claims. They simply performed jobs that the ideology claimed women could not perform, and they did so competently enough that the contradiction became undeniable. The story of German POWs encountering American women in positions of authority is not primarily about conversion or redemption. It is about the collision between ideology and observable fact. Nazi propaganda required people to believe that female leadership was unnatural, dangerous, and destined to fail. American POW camps placed German soldiers in daily contact with women whose authority was real, whose decisions mattered, and whose competence was evident. The dissonance could not be resolved through propaganda or dismissal because the evidence accumulated across months and years of direct experience. What is rarely discussed is how quiet this process was. There were no dramatic confrontations, no theatrical speeches, no symbolic moments of realization. Instead, there was repetition. Day after day of American women doing their jobs, exercising authority, and demonstrating that the Nazi worldview was simply incorrect about observable reality. This does not mean all German POWs changed their beliefs. Many did not, but the encounter created cognitive cracks that propaganda alone could not seal. When the last German POWs left American soil in 1946, they carried memories of a society that functioned in ways they had been taught were impossible. American women had not proven their worth through exceptional acts or extraordinary circumstances. They had proven it through ordinary competence, managing schedules, teaching classes, supervising labor, providing medical care, and enforcing regulations. The gender lie of Nazi ideology was not defeated by argument or persuasion. It was contradicted by reality. This matters because it reveals how propaganda ultimately fails when confronted with sustained, undeniable evidence. Beliefs about what women can or cannot do collapse when women are simply doing those things competently and consistently. The German POWs who returned home with altered perspectives did not become revolutionaries or activists. Most likely led quiet lives, but they carried with them knowledge that the world could be organized differently than they had been taught, and that the alternatives could work. In the end, the most powerful challenge to Nazi ideology came not from military defeat, but from American women proving, day after day, that authority, competence, and leadership were never about gender. They were about capability, and capability, it turned out, had nothing to do with the lies these men had been told.